It goes without saying that last year was a surprise. What I find amazing is that the releases were quite interesting, considering what happened last year. And even now, we are still talking about the watches that came out then. So can we use these as templates, in a way, to plan out what we might be seeing released this year? Are there any other references we can look back to also source and base the information on? A bit of a recap from last year. The first launch was the Tudor Black Bay 58 Navy Blue. At the time, it was one of the most spoken about watches because we simply didn't see many releases up until that point, and it got a great reception. It was by no means groundbreaking, or broke the mold, or broke away from what we know that Tudor produces now, but it was worth talking about, a gradual progression. Then at the close of last year, we saw the releases from Rolex, and quite frankly, the way they addressed their most iconic sports watch was excellent. A perfect amount of restraint, a very worthy update, and it's all that they needed to do to the watch. Then to the Oyster Perpetual line, which was a complete refresh, an almost entirely new rebranding. And those updates managed to shine the spotlight on a line of watches that, up until this point, never received much attention. So considering those small incremental changes, it was a very successful year. Can we expect to see something similar in 2021? It's hard to tell. The rumors that are spreading around at the moment is that both Rolex and Tudor are planning on releasing these new models either Q2 or Q3 this year. And where last year the focus was on the Submariner and it being incrementally improved, so we see that this year is the year of the Explorer, which is the subject that we will be investigating through this video. Now, of course, the main focal point is the Rolex Explorer 2. It is its 50th anniversary. But before discussing that watch, let's backtrack a little bit to look at models that came out before it, the ones that have really set the blueprint for all of these current releases that we are seeing. The most important watch, I believe, is the Sea Dweller 43. This watch set the new standard for the modern Rolex sports watches that we see today, which I find fascinating, well worth discussing. So what was it about this watch when it was launched that gained so much attention, disdain, and made it such a talking point? I believe this to be such a good prototype within the Rolex sports line because it just went against the grain in virtually every area. We start with the size increase, quite a contemporary size, not the 40 millimeters that we know from the Submariner, not the 44 millimeters that we knew from the Deep Sea. This measuring at 43 millimeters rode the line very neatly. To make the model a bit more proportionally balanced, they updated the width of the lugs, a 21 millimeter bracelet. All of these minute size increases are what we are now seeing with the updated Deep Sea, the updated Oyster Perpetual, the new Submariner. It's a watch that played around with proportions but also found a very neat balance. But then they also did things with the Sea Dweller 43 that went against the grain. It's a watch that always has been famously known to have a domed crystal. Of course, it's not needed anymore, so a flat sapphire crystal was incorporated, but then they decided to put a Cyclops for the date. Bear in mind that the original Sea Dwellers, all the way up until this point, pretty much 50 years of development, had never seen a Cyclops before. And beyond cosmetics, there's a reason why I'm mentioning this, which we will see in a moment. Not only did they go against tradition by incorporating the Cyclops, but then they also looked back at the original references and incorporated red Sea Dweller text. So it is by all means a very peculiar watch, one that sets the foundations for what we now see with the modern sports line. Also shows you that the brand is not afraid to go against its traditional approaches, but still does sometimes pays tribute to its past references. So bear all of that information in mind. With that out of the way, let's talk about the Explorer 2. 50th anniversary. The original Explorer 2 was released in 1971. Built to be this beefed up, hardcore variant that was less dress-oriented and made to be more purpose-driven. The whole concept around the watch was pretty simple. An orange arrow hand telling you 24-hour time. The fixed bezel allowed for you to judge the time at any point in the day. The target audience for these watches were spelunkers, cave explorers, but a group of people, a segment of professionals that aren't spoken about very often, which I think this watch really was targeted towards, are the ones that travel to the northernmost or southernmost hemispheres in the world, the North and South Pole, regions of the world where the sun neither rises nor sets, depending on the time of year. So it is an excellent tool in the kind of environment where the sun is up for 24 hours a day. But like so many other sports models of the time, it wasn't received very well. The attention was on the Submariner, the GMT, the Datejust. And this watch we can still say is pretty much the ugliest duckling that Rolex has ever made in the sports category. Of course, now it is seen as quite a legend, but back then didn't have much pull. This watch, the Explorer 2, has received many incremental improvements over time, but one of the most prolific, I believe, was a prototype that pretty much set the foundation for the Explorer 2 that we know today, and it was because of Oliver Shepard and his expedition. The Oliver Shepard Explorer is not the most famous, but what he asked the Rolex brand to do was to incorporate a GMT dial onto a fixed Explorer bezel case. And even now, when we look at the example, we can see the resemblance that it now shares with the current modern lineup. The most recent evolution of the Explorer 2 is one of the best because it calls back to the original orange hand. It keeps many of those key traits present. Most of you probably know this, but this was one of the first watches in the Rolex line to go beyond the 40mm case size to 42. At the time of this watch's release, the only watch that had ever dabbled further was the Deep Sea. So we have a good base plate, a good example of a watch that just needs a few incremental improvements. And you can sort of piece together how they can change this watch with minimal effort, but the result will still be as outstanding. So now we can look at some designs. Any anniversary, any big milestone like a 50th anniversary is always celebrated with some kind of green accent by the Rolex brand. So this is what most of us believe will be incorporated into this watch somewhere. Where exactly? It's hard to know. The simplest adjustment would be to add a green accent to both the GMT hand and the Explorer print and leave it there. All they have to do with this new launch is increase the width of the bracelet by a few millimeters to pair up with the 42mm case a little bit nicer, have a bit of a cleaner flow from A to B, incorporate some green accents, and the watch is done. But this is where I think we might see a change, something quite surprising. If you refer back to the Sea Dweller 43 and the incorporation of a Cyclops lens, something that they'd never done before, we could possibly see a ceramic bezel introduced with this model. And it's not too far-fetched to consider. Of course, it does go against the original format and idea of the solid, fixed steel bezel of the Explorer 2. The Explorer has always been a watch to be known for its fixed steel bezel, but the ceramic does offer a few more opportunities. For example, of course this might be going a bit too far, but incorporating a green bezel on this model. The issue with this idea is that it conflicts with the Kermit Submariner that we just saw released, so I don't believe that's going to be the case. But this model, with a black bezel, black dial, green accents, looks amazing. Slight adjustment to the width of the bracelet and the watch looks so complete. Now what does this piece remind you of? And where did I get this inspiration from? Well, the original GMT Master 2, the reference 116710 that was discontinued a few years ago. It's a watch that also had a black bezel, black dial, green accents. So is it too far to say that this Explorer 2 configuration could fill the void left by that original GMT? That's my thinking around the subject in any case. Though it does go against what many of us believe the Explorer 2 should look like, it is an incremental improvement. It is modernized. It seems to be lining up with a lot of what Rolex does with their current professional models. And I guess we can also debate on the practicality between steel bezels and ceramic bezels and how that works together with this watch. If you are someone who is using this watch for rock climbing, I don't think a ceramic bezel would hold up anywhere near as well as steel would. So it is questioning whether or not the ceramic bezel would be practical on a model like this. So hopefully, whatever they do with this launch, it is going to be interesting because we can see how these pieces of the puzzle have been put together. The Sea Dweller 43 as this experimental prototype that has now trickled into the Submariner lines and many others, and it's a format that I believe at this point could be easily identified with the Explorer 2 and its future development. Next, to the Explorer. This is a watch that we could also see a few surprises. We've noticed how the Oyster Perpetual has been shifted up in size. The 39mm size has been made redundant virtually, and these Explorer 39s are the last of their kind. I have a strong belief that the Explorer is going to be shifted up to 41mm, receiving all of the updates that we've already seen, like a 21mm lug width and a new movement. What I find quite interesting is that these new Oyster Perpetual models, none of them were given a white face. Could this be a telltale sign that the Explorer is going to receive a polar dial for the first time? This is a subject that I discussed last year. Whether or not we'll be seeing the standard silver hands and numeral arrangement, or if in fact we'll be seeing black outlines, a much more functional, focused Explorer in this format. If the watch on the right was released, I think it would be one of the biggest talking points. It does pay tribute to a classic prototype albino dial 1016 Explorer, so there could be some relevance in this theory. So I wouldn't say you should bank on seeing much changes with the Explorer itself. The Explorer 2 is where most of the attention is going to be, but the Explorer 1, it's going to receive a few improvements. Now this does leave quite a hole, something that's a bit perplexing. Many of us like the Explorer for its smaller size. Now being shifted to 41mm is going to divide the audience. This is where my next and final theory comes in, where Rolex shifts the size of their Explorer up, so Tudor introduces a variant of the Ranger. Now this is fun, because the Ranger has such an interesting history. Pretty much how the Explorer became famous because of the Everest expedition and the marketing behind there. The Tudor Ranger became famous because of the North Greenland expedition. One of the modern pieces that Tudor has in their lineup is the North Flag, which pays tribute to this expedition. So before getting into more detail about the design of the Ranger, why do I believe that we will be seeing these two releases happening almost simultaneously, the Explorer and the Ranger? It's not the first time. We've actually seen this happen twice in previous years. The first exhibit that we saw was the release of the Rolex GMT Pepsi and the Tudor Pepsi GMT, released the same year at Baselworld. A year later, I believe, we saw the two-tone Sea Dweller 43 released in tandem with the two-tone Heritage chronograph. And funny enough, just thinking about it now, last year we saw the Tudor Black Bay 58 navy blue, and released next to it, the Rolex Submariner. So we actually have three very clear cases of how these groups of watches are released together. So back to the Ranger. This is not the first time that Tudor has in fact released the Ranger, or a watch that was inspired by the Ranger. In 2016, I believe, we saw an updated model in 41mm with a flat end-link bracelet, a red accented seconds hand, a smiling self-winding, the Tudor rose on the dial. And what have we seen since then? Well, we've seen that Tudor has now taken their manufacturing a lot more in-house. They now make their own movements. They've pretty much rebranded themselves and their approach. So at this point, we only have two watches to really work with. The Ranger, the first example, but also the Black Bay 36. Many believe that this Black Bay 36 is almost the contemporary variant of the Ranger, and it fits the bill pretty well. So consider for a second that Rolex brings out the Explorer 41. Tudor could then approach the Ranger with a 38mm variant, filling in that open segment that many people will be looking for. If they were going to be faithful, which I believe they would be looking at the Ranger 7995/0 as the reference, a watch that was introduced in and around 1967. And it has the potential to be a knockout of a watch. Simple, classic inspirations, a clean dial form with quarter Arabics, excellent proportions, now with a few modern touches like an updated case, bracelet, a new in-house movement, possibly the addition of a big crown. And that's all they need to do. It's one of the smallest releases from the brand, but could also be one of the most impactful. Plus, it would also be great that they deviate away from the Black Bay for a change. So those are the three ideas. By no means groundbreaking, but are incremental improvements. All three upgrades, I believe, will be worthy updates. Ones that don't go against their brand identities, but also models that don't shout about their presence, about their status. What is nice about the Explorer line in general is that it's blank enough as a canvas to be creative. Whether or not Rolex will be looking to their past models and incorporating accents like different bezel formats, different numerals, different handsets, is all open to our interpretations. But I am excited to see what they plan on doing. Moving the Explorer line, one of the most coveted, professional-oriented utility watches.